Of course. Here is the script for Section 1, keeping to the point and maintaining quality. The cabin was calm, a typical first-class flight where most passengers were either absorbed in their laptops or casually sipping drinks. Kamala Harris sat near the window, reviewing her notes for an upcoming conference. The hum of the engines filled the space, a white noise that lulled the cabin into a false sense of tranquility. Then, a voice cut through the calm. A flight attendant, mid-30s, blonde, and impeccably dressed in her uniform, walked briskly toward Harris. Her steps were deliberate, her body language tense. Without warning, she leaned forward, her voice sharp and filled with an unprovoked venom. "People like you don't belong here," she hissed, her words laced with contempt. The air froze. Passengers looked up from their screens, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. The silence in the cabin was palpable, broken only by the faint clinking of ice cubes in a nearby glass. Kamala, ever composed, looked up, her brow slightly furrowed. She didn't react immediately, allowing the weight of the situation to settle. The attendant straightened, as if satisfied by the chaos she had sown, and moved toward the galley. Whispers broke out among the passengers. A man in a tailored suit leaned toward his companion and murmured, "Did she really just say that?" Others glanced at Harris, waiting for her response. Kamala took a deep breath, her expression calm but resolute. She scanned the cabin, noting the varying reactions: shock, disbelief, and a few uncomfortable shifts from those avoiding eye contact. Slowly, she reached for the call button, her deliberate action signaling she wouldn't let this slide. Before a response could come, a fellow flight attendant approached, their demeanor more composed, but their face betraying unease. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the attendant asked, their voice low and cautious. Harris nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied their reaction. The attendant lingered for a moment before retreating, avoiding further confrontation. Moments later, a folded napkin was discreetly placed on Kamala's tray table by another flight attendant. It was subtle enough to go unnoticed by most, but Harris's sharp eyes caught the gesture. She unfolded the napkin. Scrawled in hurried handwriting were the words, "You're not safe here." Kamala's grip tightened on the napkin. Her mind raced, but she remained outwardly calm. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. The implications were chilling, but she knew better than to act impulsively. A seasoned leader, she understood the importance of maintaining control, especially in a confined space with dozens of other passengers. The atmosphere grew tenser. A middle-aged woman seated across the aisle leaned over. "I saw what she said," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's disgusting. Do you need anything?" Harris gave her a reassuring nod, appreciating the quiet show of solidarity. In the galley, the offending flight attendant spoke in hushed tones with another crew member. Their body language was stiff, their gestures deliberate. Kamala noticed how their eyes flicked toward her occasionally, as if ensuring she hadn't moved. Something about the scene felt calculated, rehearsed even. As the plane continued its steady course, Harris began to piece together the details. The attack wasn't random. It was pointed, deliberate. And the napkin only confirmed her suspicions. She glanced around the cabin, observing passengers' reactions, filing away every detail for later. Some were supportive, some indifferent, but the tension was universal. Then came the captain's announcement, breaking the uneasy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be encountering some turbulence shortly, so please fasten your seatbelts." The voice was calm, routine, yet Kamala detected an edge she couldn't quite place. As the seatbelt sign blinked on, Harris noticed the blonde flight attendant returning. This time, her posture was less confrontational but no less tense. She stopped a few rows away, her eyes scanning the cabin before briefly locking with Harris's. It was fleeting but unmistakable, a silent warning. The turbulence was minor, but it added to the unease. Kamala used the moment to quietly pull out her phone. She opened her notes app and began typing. Key details: flight attendant's behavior, the cryptic message, reactions of the crew. She knew this situation demanded documentation, not just for her safety but to ensure accountability later. Across the aisle, a young passenger, no older than 20, fidgeted nervously. He had been recording on his phone discreetly, capturing snippets of the confrontation. When his eyes met Harris's, she gave a slight nod, acknowledging his efforts. He nodded back, a silent agreement that he would stand as a witness if needed. The tension in the cabin didn't dissipate. It lingered, a heavy cloud hanging over everyone. Kamala, ever composed, understood the weight of her next actions. Whatever was unfolding, it was bigger than a single racist outburst. The message on the napkin confirmed it. She knew the situation demanded not just resilience but strategy. Harris leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin once more. The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture was still obscured. For now she would wait. Whatever this was, she would meet it head-on, with grace, strength, and unwavering resolve. Let me know if you'd like the next section written in the same concise and impactful tone. The silence in the cabin had become oppressive, an unspoken agreement among passengers to avoid eye contact and bury themselves in their distractions. Kamala Harris, however, was far from distracted. She analyzed every detail with precision, each movement of the crew, and every glance exchanged between them. Her instincts told her this wasn't an isolated incident of prejudice, but something far more orchestrated. A faint click drew her attention. The overhead compartment near her seat, which had been firmly closed during boarding, was now slightly ajar. She glanced around. The flight attendants were gathered near the galley, speaking in hushed tones. One of them, the same woman who had handed her the napkin, avoided her gaze entirely. It wasn't guilt, it was fear. Kamala subtly shifted in her seat, her sharp eyes catching the movement of another passenger. A man in his late 40s, seated near the front, exchanged a glance with the lead flight attendant. Their interaction was fleeting but deliberate. She noted the man's demeanor, too composed, too confident. Was he part of this? The captain's voice broke over the intercom again. This time, it wasn't routine. There was something unsettling about his tone, as though he were reading from a script he didn't entirely trust. "We're experiencing a minor technical issue and may need to reroute for safety. Please remain seated and fasten your seat belts." Kamala's focus sharpened. Minor technical issue? The flight had been perfectly smooth, and there was no sign of turbulence or mechanical trouble. Passengers around her began murmuring anxiously, the uncertainty spreading like wildfire. She noted how quickly the flight attendants moved to quiet the cabin, their reassurances feeling rehearsed, robotic even. The man she had been observing earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hand hovered near his carry-on bag, and Kamala caught the faint glint of a metallic object peeking out from within. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't jump to conclusions, but every detail seemed to feed her growing suspicion that this wasn't merely a flight diversion. One of the flight attendants approached her row, stopping just short of her seat. "Ma'am, is there anything I can get for you?" The question was innocuous, but the tension in the woman's voice betrayed her. Kamala responded with a calm smile, masking the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm fine, thank you." As the attendant walked away, Kamala caught the faintest flicker of relief on her face. It was as if the woman was caught between two forces, one driving her actions, the other pleading for a way out. Kamala couldn't ignore the growing evidence that the crew itself was under some form of duress. The younger passenger who had recorded the earlier altercation leaned across the aisle, his voice low. "I think something's up with the captain. He's been talking to that guy up front. The one with the bag." Kamala gave him a subtle nod, her mind racing. If the captain and at least one passenger were involved, this conspiracy was far more layered than she had anticipated. She glanced down at her tray table, where the napkin lay folded neatly. Unfolding it once more, she studied the hurried handwriting. "You're not safe here." The message was clear, but its implications were terrifying. If she wasn't safe, then neither were the other passengers. And yet, she couldn't act rashly. Any misstep could escalate the situation further. Kamala decided to test her theory. She pressed the call button, summoning a flight attendant. The same woman who had confronted her earlier appeared, her expression neutral, but her body language rigid. "What can I do for you?" she asked, her tone devoid of the earlier hostility. "Could I get some water, please?" Kamala said, her voice even. The attendant hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded and walked away. Harris watched her closely, noting how she avoided the other crew members as she retrieved the water. When she returned, she leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're watching us!" Kamala didn't react outwardly, but her grip on the glass tightened. The attendant's words confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just about her. It was a coordinated effort to create fear, confusion, and possibly chaos. But why? What was the endgame? The flight continued its steady path, but the tension inside the cabin was anything but smooth. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. The man with the carry-on bag adjusted his seat, his eyes scanning the cabin as if assessing his surroundings. Kamala noticed how the flight attendants avoided him entirely, their fear evident in their hurried movements. She needed more information. Discreetly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Airplane mode prevented her from reaching anyone outside, but she began typing notes in her memo app. Every detail, the suspicious behavior of the crew, the cryptic napkin, the man with the bag, was documented. If she couldn't act now, she would ensure the truth came out later. Another announcement from the captain interrupted her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending shortly as part of our rerouting. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the crew." The calm tone only heightened her suspicion. Descending to where? The flight path hadn't suggested any nearby emergency landing options. Kamala's instincts told her this wasn't about technical difficulties. The timing of the announcement, the escalating tension among the crew, and the mysterious passenger all pointed to a coordinated plan. But what was the goal? Was it to create a spectacle? To discredit her? Or something far worse? Her mind raced as she considered her options. Confrontation could backfire, but silence could be equally dangerous. For now, she would wait, observing every move, every word, every glance. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight, she was a target. And whoever had orchestrated this had underestimated her resilience. As the plane began its gradual descent, Kamala's resolve hardened. Whatever was happening, she would meet it with the same strength and leadership that had defined her career. This was no ordinary flight, and she was no ordinary passenger. The game was on, and she intended to win. "Let me know when you're ready for Section 3. The descent began, but the atmosphere in the cabin only grew heavier. Kamala Harris felt every subtle shift in tone and behavior. The crew's movements were now more coordinated, almost too polished, as if rehearsing for a performance. She watched their interactions closely, their glances revealing a level of tension that couldn't be ignored. A sudden shift drew her attention. The man with the bag moved toward the galley, his posture rigid. Kamala noted the subtle nod exchanged between him and one of the flight attendants. It wasn't casual, it was deliberate. Something was unfolding, and it was clear that everyone involved knew their roles. The young man who had recorded earlier leaned toward Kamala again. "That guy's up to something. He's been pacing for the last 20 minutes. His voice was quiet, but his concern was evident. Kamala's instincts told her to remain calm. Reacting prematurely could trigger exactly what they were planning. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom again. "We'll be landing shortly. Please follow all crew instructions." The message, though routine on the surface, carried an underlying tension. Kamala could feel the anxiety ripple through the passengers. No one knew where they were landing or why. Kamala's focus shifted to the lead flight attendant, who appeared visibly torn. She moved toward Kamala with a forced calmness, kneeling slightly to whisper, "I can't say much, but please trust me when I tell you to stay quiet until we land." Kamala met her gaze, reading the desperation in her eyes. Whatever was happening, this attendant was clearly caught in the middle of something far bigger than herself. Kamala nodded subtly, her mind working quickly. This woman could be an ally, but only if she wasn't under direct threat. The layers of manipulation within the crew were becoming more evident. It wasn't just about creating chaos. It was about maintaining control until they reached their destination. The man with the bag returned to his seat, his demeanor more relaxed now, as if his part in this had been completed. Kamala tracked his movements, observing the way he interacted with the crew. Every gesture, every look, added another piece to the puzzle. The woman who had handed her the napkin earlier avoided her completely now, her fear palpable. Kamala wondered if the cryptic message had put her at greater risk. This wasn't just about orchestrating a confrontation with Kamala. It was about silencing anyone who might disrupt their plan. Another announcement came, this time from one of the attendants. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for landing. We'll be arriving at an alternate airport due to unforeseen circumstances." The vagueness of the statement only heightened the passengers' anxiety. Kamala could feel the collective unease growing, and she knew that keeping calm was critical. As the plane continued its descent, Kamala noticed a subtle change in the lighting of the cabin. The previously warm and inviting glow now felt stark, almost clinical. It was as though the environment itself was being manipulated to heighten tension. She turned her attention back to the lead attendant, who was now moving deliberately down the aisle, checking seat belts and tray tables. When she reached Kamala, she paused for just a moment. Their eyes met, and the attendant's expression conveyed something unspoken, an apology, perhaps, or a plea for understanding. Kamala didn't flinch. She maintained her calm exterior, knowing that every passenger was looking to her for cues. The weight of their silent trust pressed heavily on her, but she welcomed it. Leadership wasn't just about action, it was about presence. The man with the bag shifted again, this time standing and retrieving something from the overhead compartment. Kamala's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of what looked like a file folder, its edges worn and creased. He moved toward the galley once more, handing it discreetly to one of the attendants. The exchange was quick, but its significance wasn't lost on her. The young passenger whispered again, his voice more urgent now. "They're planning something. I can feel it. That guy's been too calm this whole time." Kamala nodded slightly, her mind racing. She needed to keep him calm, to ensure that panic didn't spread among the passengers. Her focus returned to the captain's voice, now speaking in low tones through the intercom. "We'll be touching down in 10 minutes. Thank you for your patience." The forced cheerfulness in his tone was unnerving, a thin veneer over the tension that had gripped everyone on board. Kamala's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The precision, the coordination, it all pointed to a larger operation designed to undermine her. But why? And who was behind it? The answer, she suspected, lay in the cryptic actions of the man with the bag and the fear in the eyes of the crew. Whatever their plan was, it hinged on her silence. And that, she decided, was something they wouldn't get. As the wheels prepared to touch the ground, Kamala steeled herself. The game was nearing its climax, and she was ready to meet it head-on. Quietly, she adjusted her position, preparing for whatever awaited them after landing. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was a target, yes, but more importantly, she was a leader. And she wasn't about to let fear dictate her actions. Let me know when you'd like Section 4. The plane touched down smoothly, but the sense of relief most passengers expected never came. Instead, a hush fell over the cabin, thick with tension and unanswered questions. Kamala Harris noted every detail as the aircraft rolled to a stop on an unfamiliar runway. There were no signs of a traditional airport, no bustling terminals or lit runways, just an expanse of darkness and a few scattered lights. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Please remain seated as we undergo routine checks before deplaning. We appreciate your patience." The words, framed as standard protocol, felt deliberately vague. Kamala scanned the reactions of the other passengers. Confusion mixed with unease, and whispered conversations broke out among them. One of the flight attendants, the same woman who had warned Kamala earlier, moved through the cabin. Her movements were robotic, her face blank, but Kamala could see the slight tremor in her hands. She was afraid. The lead attendant, on the other hand, maintained a calm yet detached demeanor, her eyes darting to the man with the bag. He remained seated, his body language unnervingly relaxed. His confidence stood in stark contrast to the growing anxiety around him. Kamala noticed him pull out his phone, scrolling casually as if this was any other flight. It was a deliberate act, designed to project normalcy, but it only made him stand out more. Two black SUVs appeared on the tarmac, their headlights cutting through the dark. Kamala's suspicions deepened. This wasn't a routine landing. The vehicle stopped near the aircraft, and several figures in dark uniforms stepped out. Their movements were efficient, their presence commanding, yet no logos or insignias identified them. Whoever they weren't ordinary airport personnel. The flight attendants began moving down the aisles, instructing passengers to stay seated. Their voices, while professional, carried an edge of urgency. Kamala could feel the energy shift. Whatever was about to happen, it was orchestrated. Her mind worked quickly. She reached into her pocket, retrieving the napkin with the cryptic message. The words, "You're not safe here," had taken on an even graver meaning. She carefully folded it again, tucking it away. If these unknown figures were involved, she couldn't risk revealing that she had any prior warning. The man with the bag stood suddenly, ignoring the instructions to remain seated. One of the attendants moved to intercept him, but he waved her off with an air of authority. He walked confidently to the galley, where he handed something, a small package, to the lead attendant. Kamala watched as the package was quickly hidden beneath the service counter. The young passenger who had been recording earlier leaned closer to Kamala. "What's going on?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She glanced at him, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Just observe," she said softly. "Don't react unless you need to." One of the men from the SUVs boarded the plane. His presence was commanding, his face unreadable. He wore a dark suit, his posture stiff and authoritative. Without addressing the passengers, he moved to the galley and began speaking quietly with the lead flight attendant. Kamala strained to hear, catching only fragments of their conversation. Words like "secure transport" and "priority" stood out. Another man entered, this one wearing a headset and carrying a clipboard. He approached the first man, handing him a document. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the passengers were secondary to the operation at hand. Kamala's attention was drawn to the window, where another figure emerged from the second SUV. This person moved more deliberately, scanning the plane from the outside. They wore a long coat, their face obscured by the shadows. Kamala's instincts told her this wasn't just about her. This was part of something much larger. The lead attendant finally addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. We'll be conducting a brief inspection before allowing anyone to disembark. Please remain in your seats." Her voice, though calm, lacked its earlier edge of control. Kamala noticed the subtle tension in her jawline, the way her eyes flickered toward the man in the suit. Kamala knew this was her moment to act. She reached into her pocket again, this time pulling out her phone. While she couldn't contact anyone directly, she began drafting a detailed message. She documented every detail: the unknown men, the SUVs, the package, and the peculiar behavior of the crew. If anything happened, this record would ensure the truth couldn't be buried. The man in the suit walked through the cabin, his eyes scanning each passenger. He stopped briefly near Kamala, his gaze lingering. She met his stare with unwavering calm, refusing to give any indication of fear or uncertainty. He moved on after a moment, continuing toward the back of the plane. The young passenger across the aisle tapped on his phone, likely continuing his recording. Kamala gave him the faintest nod of approval. Every piece of evidence mattered now. They were no longer just witnesses. They were documenting a moment that could unravel a much larger plan. The sound of footsteps echoed as another man boarded. This one appeared older, his demeanor more calculating. He approached the man with the clipboard, speaking in low tones. Kamala caught the words VIP and extraction, her suspicions solidifying further. This wasn't about safety. This was about control, and she was the focal point. Passengers began whispering again, their fear becoming more vocal. Kamala raised a hand slightly, signaling for calm. Her composure was contagious, and the murmurs quieted. She knew that panic would only play into their hands. The man with the bag returned to his seat, his expression neutral. He pulled out a pen and began writing on a small notepad, ignoring the growing tension. Kamala observed every movement, every gesture, filing it away for later. The lead attendant returned to the galley, where she spoke briefly with the man in the suit. He nodded, then stepped toward the cabin door. Kamala's focus sharpened. This was the moment. Whatever their plan was, it was about to unfold. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting the space in an eerie glow. Kamala's grip tightened on her phone as she prepared herself mentally. The stakes were higher than ever, but she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She had faced pressure before, but this was different. This was personal, calculated, and dangerous. The next move was theirs, but Kamala was ready. She wouldn't be a passive participant in their game. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. "Let me know when you're ready for Section 5. The cabin was silent, a suffocating stillness punctuated only by the faint hum of the engines. The man in the suit returned from the galley, his expression unreadable, and stood at the front of the cabin. His gaze swept across the passengers, pausing for a fraction of a second on Kamala Harris before moving on. The deliberate nature of his movements wasn't lost on her. Kamala remained still, her mind racing to connect the fragments of information she had gathered. The cryptic behavior of the crew, the suspicious man with the bag, the shadowy figures outside, all pointed to a coordinated effort. But the motivations remained unclear. Was this about discrediting her? Intimidation? Or something far more sinister? The lead flight attendant approached her seat. Her voice was low, barely a whisper. "They want to speak with you privately," she said, her hands trembling slightly. Kamala's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm. She met the woman's eyes, and saw a flicker of desperation there, a silent plea for something unspoken. "Who wants to speak with me?" Kamala asked evenly, her voice betraying no fear. The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the man in the suit. "Them," she said finally, her voice trembling on the edge of defiance. Kamala nodded, standing slowly. She knew this was a pivotal moment. The eyes of the passengers followed her as she moved toward the front of the plane, their silent support palpable. The man with the bag watched her with an unsettling calmness, his hands resting casually on his knees. The young passenger who had been recording earlier gave her a brief, encouraging nod. She reached the galley, where the man in the suit waited. Without a word, he gestured for her to step into the narrow corridor near the cockpit. Kamala entered, her posture steady, projecting the confidence she knew was vital in this moment. The corridor was dimly lit, the shadows creating an oppressive atmosphere. The older man she had seen earlier joined them, his face lined with age, but his eyes sharp and calculating. He carried a small folder, its edges frayed, and opened it without preamble. "Miss Harris," he began, his tone clipped and professional. "We have some concerns about your presence on this flight." Kamala raised an eyebrow. "Concerns?" she repeated, her voice calm but edged with authority. "Care to elaborate?" The man hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say your influence has made certain individuals uncomfortable," he said finally, his words carefully chosen. "This is a precautionary measure." "A precaution against what?" Kamala pressed, her gaze unwavering. "Speaking truth? Advocating for equality? I didn't realize those were threats." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, transcripts, and notes. Kamala recognized some of the images immediately: rallies she had attended, meetings with grassroots leaders, and policy discussions. These were public events, meticulously documented, but the context they were presented in seemed deliberately skewed. "What exactly am I looking at?" she asked, flipping through the pages. "A narrative," the older man admitted, his voice lowering. "One that could be reshaped depending on how this situation unfolds." Kamala understood instantly. This wasn't about her actions or policies. It was about creating a story, a weaponized version of her reality that could be used to undermine her credibility. The incident with the flight attendant, the cryptic warnings, the sudden rerouting of the plane, it was all part of a larger scheme to stage a scandal. Her mind raced, analyzing her options. She could confront them directly, but that might escalate the situation and put the passengers at risk. Alternatively, she could play along, gathering more information to expose the truth later. The latter felt more strategic, but it required restraint and precision. She closed the folder and met the man's gaze. "You've gone to a lot of trouble for this," she said, her tone steady. "Why? What's the endgame?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exchanged a look with the man in the suit, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Let's just say we have powerful interests at play," he said cryptically. "Interests that see your influence as disruptive." Kamala allowed the words to settle. "Disruptive," she repeated softly. "That's an interesting choice of words. Disruptive to what, exactly? Inequality? Injustice?" The man's expression hardened. "You're clever, Miss Harris. But cleverness can only take you so far. Sometimes, it's better to cooperate." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what does cooperation look like in your mind?" "Simple," he said, his tone growing colder. "Stay quiet about this incident. Accept the narrative we provide. In return, you avoid complications." Kamala suppressed the urge to laugh at the absurdity of the offer. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Then you'll see just how quickly the narrative can turn against you." Kamala straightened, her resolve unshaken. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice firm. "You may have powerful interests backing you, but I've faced challenges far greater than this. If you think intimidation will silence me, you grossly underestimated who I am." The man regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped back, signaling the end of the conversation. "We'll see," he said simply, his tone carrying an air of finality. As Kamala returned to her seat, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. The stakes were higher than she had initially realized, but so was her determination. She had faced adversity before, and she would face this with the same resilience. The truth would come out, and those who sought to manipulate her would learn the strength of her resolve. "Let me know when you're ready for Section 6. The plane had landed, but no one moved. Passengers remained seated, their silence now a mix of confusion and unease. Kamala Harris sat quietly, her gaze steady as she assessed the cabin. The events of the past hour played out in her mind, every detail scrutinized. She knew the situation had reached its critical point, and the next moments would determine the outcome. Outside, the figures near the SUVs moved with precision, their faces unreadable in the dim light. They spoke into earpieces, their movements purposeful but not hurried. It was a stark contrast to the rising tension inside the plane. The young passenger across the aisle tapped on his phone again, documenting everything. Kamala caught his eye, giving a slight nod. Every piece of evidence mattered now. The lead flight attendant reappeared, her composure faltering as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience. For your safety, we ask that you remain seated while we complete our procedures." Her words were carefully chosen, but the fear in her voice was evident. Kamala's instincts told her the attendant was operating under orders she couldn't refuse. The man with the bag stood again, drawing the attention of several passengers. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as he retrieved the package he had handed off earlier. He turned toward the galley, where the lead attendant waited, and passed it back to her with a curt nod. Kamala's eyes narrowed as she tracked the exchange. A low murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers began to question what was happening. "Why can't we leave?" a woman near the back asked. "What's going on?" Another voice chimed in, louder this time. The tension was building, and Kamala knew it wouldn't be long before the unease turned into panic. The man in the suit re-entered the cabin, his presence immediately silencing the whispers. He moved to the front, addressing the passengers with a calm but authoritative tone. "We understand your concerns," he said. "This is a routine security protocol, and we appreciate your cooperation." His words did little to ease the anxiety. Kamala noted how his gaze lingered on her, as if gauging her reaction. She met his eyes, her expression unwavering. She could see the challenge in his posture, the unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't routine at all. The lead attendant approached Kamala's seat again, her voice low and trembling. "They want to search the cabin," she said. Kamala tilted her head slightly. "Search for what?" she asked. The attendant hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before replying. "They didn't say." Kamala could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The search wasn't about finding something. It was about creating a pretext, a justification for whatever narrative they intended to construct. She remained still, her mind racing through possible responses. Confronting them now could escalate the situation, but remaining silent risked allowing them to manipulate the truth. The man with the bag moved toward the front of the cabin, his posture casual, but his intentions clear. He handed a small device to the man in the suit, who examined it briefly before nodding. Kamala couldn't see what it was, but the exchange confirmed her suspicions. This was no ordinary flight, and she was at the center of their carefully orchestrated plan. She glanced at the young passenger, who was still recording discreetly. His determination reminded her of why she fought so hard for justice and accountability. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who faced similar battles without the platform or resources to fight back. The man in the suit addressed the passengers again. "We're almost done," he said. "Thank you for your patience." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Kamala could see the frustration building among the passengers. They wanted answers, but none were forthcoming. Suddenly, the older man from earlier entered the cabin, his expression grim. He moved directly to Kamala, leaning down to speak in a low voice. "You have a choice," he said. "Cooperate, and this ends quietly. Resist, and things will become complicated." Kamala met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly do you want me to cooperate with?" she asked. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Stay silent," he said simply. "About everything." "And if I don't?" she pressed. The man straightened, his expression hardening. "Then you'll see the consequences firsthand." Kamala leaned back in her seat, her mind made up. "The truth has a way of coming out," she said evenly. "No matter how much you try to control it." The man studied her for a moment before walking away. Kamala's resolve only strengthened. She wasn't afraid of their threats. She had faced far greater challenges and emerged stronger each time. This would be no different. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the end of their procedure, Kamala felt a shift in the energy around her. The passengers, emboldened by her calm defiance, began to speak up. "We deserve to know what's going on," one man said. Others murmured their agreement, their voices growing louder. The man in the suit returned, his expression tight. "We're done here," he said, his voice clipped. "You'll all be free to disembark shortly." Kamala knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As the passengers began gathering their belongings, she remained seated, her mind already formulating the next steps. She would ensure the truth came to light, no matter what it took. "Let me know when you're ready for Section 7. The passengers finally began to disembark, their expressions a mix of relief and residual tension. Kamala Harris waited, letting the others move first. She observed the crew closely, particularly the lead flight attendant, whose rigid posture betrayed a mix of exhaustion and fear. The man with the bag was nowhere to be seen, having slipped out quietly with the men in suits. His absence spoke volumes about the operation's shadowy nature. As Kamala stepped off the plane, the night air hit her with a crisp intensity, and she took a moment to ground herself. The dark SUVs were still parked nearby, their engines humming softly. The figures who had orchestrated the unsettling series of events stood by, speaking in low tones. She made no move to approach them, but her presence was enough to remind them she wouldn't be easily intimidated. A few passengers lingered near the terminal, discussing the strange events with a mix of confusion and speculation. Kamala approached the young passenger who had been recording throughout the ordeal. "Keep those videos safe," she said, her tone calm but resolute. "They'll be important." The young man nodded, his expression serious. "I'll make sure they don't disappear." Inside the terminal, Kamala's team was already waiting. They had been tracking the flight's diversion and the lack of communication from the airline. Her chief aide approached her quickly. "Are you okay?" they asked, their voice filled with concern. Kamala nodded, but her mind was already on the next steps. "We need to act fast," she said. "This wasn't just an incident, it was a coordinated effort." The aide handed her a phone, already connected to a secure line. Kamala spoke quickly and decisively, outlining the events with precision. She described the cryptic warnings, the orchestrated behavior of the crew, and the involvement of the shadowy figures who had taken over the flight. Every detail was documented, every inconsistency noted. Her voice remained steady, but the weight of the experience was clear. This wasn't just about her. It was about the implications of allowing such actions to go unchecked. If those behind this operation were willing to target her so brazenly, who else might they endanger? She refused to let fear silence her. By the time she finished the call, a plan was already forming. The videos and testimonies from the passengers would be crucial, as with the napkin with the cryptic warning. Kamala had ensured its safety, knowing it was a key piece of evidence. The narrative they had attempted to construct would unravel under the weight of the truth. As the night wore on, Kamala's focus never wavered. She held a brief meeting with her team, strategizing their next moves. The media would need to be informed, but carefully. This wasn't just a story. It was an opportunity to expose the darker forces operating behind the scenes. The world needed to know what had happened, not as a spectacle but as a call to action. Her resolve was mirrored by those around her. The young passenger who had recorded the events pledged to share his footage, despite any potential risks. Other passengers reached out, offering their accounts and expressing support. The flight attendant, who had handed her the warning napkin, contacted Kamala's office later that night, sharing her side of the story in a trembling voice. She revealed the pressure she had faced, the threats made against her family, and the guilt she carried for her role in the ordeal. Kamala listened carefully, her empathy evident. "You were placed in an impossible situation," she said gently. "What matters now is that you're willing to stand up and speak the truth." The next morning, the story broke. Carefully curated footage and detailed accounts began to circulate, not as sensationalized headlines, but as a testament to resilience and accountability. Kamala held a press conference, her voice steady as she addressed the nation. She spoke not just of her experience, but of the broader issues it represented, the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of standing up against injustice, and the need for systemic change. Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across the country. People who had faced similar forms of intimidation and manipulation came forward, sharing their stories. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. What had begun as an attempt to undermine her had become a catalyst for advocacy and change. The investigation into the flight's events uncovered a network of individuals tied to powerful interests. The man with the bag was identified as a key operative, his actions linked to a broader scheme targeting public figures. The airline faced scrutiny for its role, with calls for greater transparency and accountability growing louder. Through it all, Kamala remained steadfast. She met with the passengers who had supported her, thanking them for their courage. She stayed in contact with the flight attendant, ensuring she had the resources and protection she needed to rebuild her life. Kamala's actions weren't just about seeking justice for herself. They were about creating a legacy of empowerment and resilience. Months later, as policies were implemented to address the vulnerabilities exposed by the incident, Kamala reflected on the journey. The challenges she had faced were daunting, but they had only strengthened her resolve. She knew the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but she was ready to continue it, bolstered by the knowledge that even in the face of adversity, truth and resilience could prevail. As she prepared for her next challenge, Kamala carried with her the lessons of that night. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about transforming the experience into a force for good. And in doing so, she ensured that those who had tried to silence her would never succeed in silencing the voices of so many others. Let me know if you need any further refinements.